Mike Bird, The Land Trap, A New History of the World's Oldest Asset. 1. The Lie of the Land. About 3,200 years ago, more than a millennium before Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon and the beginnings of the Roman Empire, more than 6 centuries before the birth of either Plato or Confucius, a lucky servant named Munabitu received a gift of land from Melisipak II, one of the Kassite kings who reigned in ancient Babylon. We know quite a few things about Munabitu and his patch of earth. We know that he owned several hundred acres, a little more than a square mile. The parcel would have made him moderately rich, but not immensely so. We know that the land was on the banks of a canal, in a place called Hudadu, possibly an ancient name for Baghdad. We know the name of some of Munabitu's neighbors too, because he faced a legal challenge over the ownership of his plot, and we know that the decision eventually fell in Munabitu's favor. We know the names of the officials who adjudicated the disagreement, and we know the names of the bureaucrats who trekked from the royal palace of Marduk Apla Idina Thirst, the son of Meli Sipak II, to confirm the size of the estate. We know more with some degree of certainty about Munabitu, a Babylonian servant who lived in the dying days of the Bronze Age, who was otherwise a historical nobody, than we do about many of the kings, warriors, scholars, and prophets who were born during the centuries and millennia that followed. We know about Munabitu specifically, and solely because of the land he possessed, the ownership and saga of which is carved into a piece of smooth black limestone, around half a meter long. The stone was recovered from Susa, in Iran, by archaeologists in the early 20th century. Known as a kuduru, the stone was the centrally held record of the servant's land ownership. Munabitu likely would have had a replica of his own to prove possession to any subsequent doubters. The fact that Munabitu's story was recorded in such a permanent manner, and survived for thousands of years even as so much other knowledge was lost, is not some fluke of history. Munabitu's wealth was carved indelibly into solid stone for a good reason. For many early civilizations, land was power. Governments collected taxes in the form of grain, for which records of ownership were of the utmost importance. Without knowing who owned each segment of earth, it was impossible to know who owed what to the tax collectors. For the very earliest agricultural economies, the way in which land was owned, organized and used was one of the foremost priorities of state building, which made the difference between economic survival and total collapse. Across a range of ancient languages, among different civilizations spread thousands of miles around the world, some of the very earliest surviving records are those that delineate land ownership. In India, flat copper plates recorded grants of land from local rulers, often to religious establishments from as early as the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. In Egypt, tombs that were built and sealed more than 4,000 years ago are inscribed with the details of the lives of the men buried within, including descriptions of the land they owned. Before the existence of investment funds, pensions, stocks, bonds, or international currency markets, even before human history was recorded in any meaningful way, land was the original asset. The ability to own and control territory was the first means of turning power into wealth. Munabitu would presumably find a lot of things about the modern world very confusing, but there are elements that might seem familiar to him. After centuries of gargantuan social and economic change, land is still at the center of our world. Owning it still confers social status and financial security. It is still the asset that governs the course of our lives, our successes and failures, more than any other form of wealth. Today, land remains the world's largest single asset by some margin and a prized possession to its owners. One estimate, by the MC Kinsey Global Institute, pins the total value of land at about 35% of the $520 trillion in real wealth on Earth, a category that includes all of the physical and intangible assets in the world, from buildings to intellectual property. The total sum of the machinery, infrastructure, and equipment across the planet makes up another 17%, while commercial property and residential housing, the actual structures on top of the land, are worth another 11% and 21% apiece. That makes the market in land about twice as valuable as all of the listed companies on every stock exchange in the world. While those publicly traded securities are monitored, second by second, by a global army of investors and a breathless financial media, land is relegated to a second-order asset, hidden within the categories of housing and real estate. When we talk about commercial and residential property, the terms we use tend to give the impression that it is the buildings, rather than the earth below them, that hold most of the real value. But in the bustling cities, where housing and property are most expensive, that is overwhelmingly because of the high price of land. Most of the variations in the price of properties, street by street, town by town, and indeed country by country, are variations in the cost of land, not the structures on top. In places where real estate is most expensive, land makes up a far larger share of the total value of properties. In an increasingly intangible and digital world, the centrality of land poses a puzzle. Since the turn of the 21st century, the share of land in private assets in the countries across the rich world, those for which data is available, has risen from 18 to 26% on average, relative to all the other forms of wealth taken together. Both financial assets like stocks and bonds, and real wealth like buildings, machinery, and intellectual property. The importance of land has only increased, even as the world seems to have become more incorporeal. In the booming economies of East Asia, the source of so much of the world's economic growth over the last 3 decades, the value of land has exploded. In China alone, a tremendous real estate boom has created tens of trillions of dollars of land wealth. No asset is more powerful in global finance than land, which serves as a form of vital security to lenders in rich and poor countries alike, enabling tremendous volumes of borrowing for households, small companies, and entire governments. The immense power of land is also what can make it enormously dangerous. Many of the biggest economic and social challenges that we believe are disparate and unrelated problems, financial booms and busts, sluggish economic growth, the persistence of inequality, and the bitter zero-sum politics of today and throughout history, are rooted in land, and the unique ways it functions as an asset. The explanation of why the world is still so hooked on our most ancient form of wealth, how we reach this state of affairs, and the dangers it poses to us all are the focus of this book. The nature of land, who owns it, and its vital position in the financial system matter enormously for every one of us, even when we don't know it. It is not just the most important asset to the billions of ordinary people for whom it is their greatest store of wealth, but one that can make and break families, businesses, and even entire nations. For the vast majority of recorded human history, through the Babylonian Empire and for millennia afterwards, well into the 20th century for most of the world, life was simple, local, and rural. People were overwhelmingly poor, What wealth they had, if any, stemmed mostly from their land, what could be grown from it, raised on it, and mined from it. For those who owned a great deal of land, their holdings often conferred power over, and responsibility for the people who lived on it too. The very highest positions of status in pre-industrial Europe. Ope and Asia often went hand in hand with huge quantities of arable land. The inhabitants of the land owed a chunk of their labor, crops, income, or all three to the class of elites who possessed the vast agricultural estates on which peasants lived and died. When the men who tilled the soil were called on to fight and die in wars in Europe, it was the landed gentry, earls and barons, seigneurs and lincheren, who pressed the unfortunate conscripts into service. These landed aristocrats played a vital role in governing their countries, acting as the sometimes brutal intermediaries between the rural population and the feeble central government, a hierarchy that emerged all over the pre-modern world. This book aims to answer the question of why land is so important today, and why it will continue to shape and threaten our future. But understanding how the world's most important asset was once used is more than just a matter of distant social history. It is a vital part of understanding the grip that land holds over society today, and why people are so attached to the idea of owning it. Beyond every other common source of wealth, land is symbolic and stirs powerful emotions. Throughout history, the ownership of land has conferred liberation from serfdom and feudalism, a totem of freedom from the yoke of the landlord. In much of the world, it still symbolizes something similar, becoming an owner of land, and the real estate on top of it secures membership in the stable and independent middle classes. It is a symbol of adulthood and financial security. People believe not just that land belongs to them, but that they belong to it too. It is deeply wrapped up with conceptions of belonging and identity, the very core of how people define who they are. But the last 350 years of human history, which will be the focus of this book, have been profoundly different from the centuries, even millennia, that preceded them. That chunk of time has been a transformative but brief sliver of our history, like a sudden handbrake turn after thousands of miles of familiar, steady driving. As the era of industrialization began, the world shifted from one in which the production and distribution of food was the dominant form of commercial activity to one in which agriculture accounts for not even a 20th of global economic output. In the richest nations of the world today, farming usually accounts for less than a percentage point of a country's GDP and fewer than 1 in 50 jobs. Taxes are paid not in grain or military service, but in money. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the last of Europe's tens of millions of serfs, who had previously been tied directly to the land on which they lived, were emancipated from attachments to their landlords. The previously rural populations of Europe and North America flooded into new and burgeoning cities. Places that barely registered on the map were quickly populated by hundreds of thousands of residents. New and vastly more productive forms of manufacturing, transport, trade and communication emerged. The ancient role of land began to ebb away. The enormous estates where tenants farmed the land, which had previously been the most valuable assets of all, declined in both value and esteem. The world we know today was being born. Almost everything about the way we live has been transformed since Munabitu's era, and even since the first Europeans began to arrive in North America. But land is still crucially important to the global economy and the everyday lives of people all over the world. Its significance stems from three crucial features, which explain why its value has only risen, even as its original role as a source of food and raw commodities has become so much less important. These features help to explain why it remains the most important asset in the financial system and the store of such enormous wealth today. They are also what makes it the source of a great deal of global inequality. Land defies some of the usual laws of capitalism that apply to other assets and goods. Its special features are also what make land so profoundly dangerous and such a crucial component in catastrophic financial crises. The first of these special features is that it is incredibly difficult, usually impossible, to create more land. In the terminology of economists, its supply is fixed. A few modest slivers of earth have been created in a process known as reclamation. It has been possible on the coast of the Netherlands and the city-state of Singapore and in Tokyo Bay. Where that is possible, it is an enormously worthwhile pursuit, which can create hundreds of billions of dollars in valuable earth. But in the aggregate, there is barely any more land in the world today than there was before the Industrial Revolution began. That makes land unlike any of the other goods or assets we produce for one another, which have exploded in scale in response to ever-growing demand. When people want more of something, it rises in price, and new producers rush to make similar items. In stark contrast, acquiring more land, especially in popular areas, means buying or taking it from someone else. Most forms of wealth are what economists call positive sum, meaning that one person gaining more of it does not mean another person is losing out. But land is very often a zero-sum asset. During the period of rapid economic growth, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the supply and nature of all the other things we value has changed continuously. Inventive new ways of doing things have rapidly eclipsed old methods. Among the 5 largest American companies today, collectively worth more than $15 trillion at the end of 2024, just one, Microsoft, has been around for as long as 50 years. Several of the mighty corporate giants of the recent past, former technological leaders like Kodak, Polaroid, Nokia, and Motorola among them, once seemed immovable but have plunged into irrelevance. Businesses are continually pressed to create new goods and services by relentless competition, and those that stand still are quickly crushed. If much of the machinery, technology, and intellectual property that was enormously valuable as recently as 20 years ago was transported to the modern era, it would be almost completely worthless, designed for markets that no longer exist, and with methods that now seem archaic. Land is fundamentally different. In the old real estate investor's platitude, they're not making any more of it. The second crucial factor that makes land so different from every other asset is its immobility. It can't be picked up and moved somewhere. It might be more useful. When the land in a buzzing urban area becomes enormously valuable, more land cannot be brought in from a place where it is still dirt cheap. The other parts of an economy are far more fluid and movable. People migrate between neighborhoods, to new cities, and across borders in search of fresh opportunities. Equipment and machinery can be transported by road, rail, sea, and air. Ideas flow so very freely that governments institute laws to prevent the theft of. New concepts and inventions, even the buildings on top of land, can be moved in extreme circumstances, and the parts from which they were built can be recycled and reused. Not so with land. The fact that new land is both rarely created and cannot be moved around explains why a patch of otherwise unremarkable earth in the center of New York City is worth tens of thousands of times more than one of identical size in North Dakota. The two are not interchangeable. As economies around the world have become more industrial and more urban in the last 3 centuries, the value of land has been increasingly determined not by what can be grown from it or dug out of it, but by what sort of activity is going on all around it. That is the reason previously cheap land surges in value when new transport connections open nearby. Land in a bustling city has many uses. It can host housing, commercial property, transport infrastructure, or vital green space. But when it is in use, it cannot be used for something else. As industry boomed in the 19th century, land in the center of cities became far more important. Areas surrounding new canals, docks, and railways, the arteries of burgeoning trade, were increasingly sought after. Space was needed for any manner of factories, mills, transportation, and housing for the new urbanites. The third special characteristic of land is perhaps the least well understood, but one of the most important in explaining its role in the modern economy. Unlike almost everything else we value, land does not really decay. In accounting terms, it does not depreciate. If a plot is located in an area with a large population and bustling economic activity, there is no reason to expect it to lose any value over decades or even centuries. As a result, some of the oldest fortunes in the world are held by ancient families who have done little more than hang on to land in the city centres that have stood the test of time. Britain's Dukes of Westminster and the Earls Cadogan survived the financial collapse of the British aristocracy through their huge landholdings in London, which have made the current holders of those titles the 3rd and 14th richest people in the country today. Those storied families are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to dynastic wealth in land. There are many thousands of miniature monopolies in the most productive, dynamic, and land-constrained cities. No other asset of any significant value is so long-lived. The buildings on top of the land, however well constructed, will eventually collapse, or at least require extensive and costly renovation. A new car plunges in value the moment it is driven off the salesman's lot. Machines made with the best new technologies will eventually, and sometimes quickly, become obsolete. Human beings age and die. As technological progress marches on, entire categories of things that were once crucial assets for businesses everywhere, like horses, wagons, and canal boats, are now irrelevant across much of the world, retained for entertainment, but worthless for their original purpose. Even the most valuable ideas and innovations collapse in value as they are overtaken by improvements and alternatives. Unlike the value of a company, the price of land is not based on the innovation, leadership skills, or hard work of its owners. Its value is based overwhelmingly on the actions of people living and working near it. Indeed, the very people who make land increasingly valuable are often those most disadvantaged by increases in its value. The thousands of workers that flow into bustling cities each morning on buses, cars, and trains are what give the properties in those places their eye-watering rents and exorbitant prices. The same people pay steep rents to live nearby, often scrimping and saving for decades to acquire some modest share of land wealth for themselves. The windfall from rising land values is reaped by those who had the good fortune to buy it in a particular place at a particular time, before prices began to rise. It is, for the most part, a game of luck. These 3 crucial factors, the fixed amount of land available, its immobility, and the fact that it does not naturally decay, are what mark it out from every other asset in the world. They explain most of why land assets are still such a store of enormous wealth today, even as its earliest functions, as the basis of agriculture and the organizing node of state power, are so much less relevant in modern economies and political systems. And they're also why land can be so profoundly dangerous to our collective prosperity today. As the importance of agriculture began to decline, the social structures and ways of thinking that had governed Europe were on the way out too. The Age of Reason and the Enlightenment ushered in the new ideas that would reshape the Western world. Political ideologies like liberalism, socialism, and nationalism, as we know them today, were beginning to come into focus. In English coffeehouses, at universities dotted from Edinburgh to Naples, and among intellectual networks stretched across the Atlantic Ocean and into the Americas, the Western world was abuzz with new discussions and fiery debates about philosophy and science. The ideas about money, finance, and wealth that emerged from these new intellectual circles would come to transform the world as much as any of the new political ideologies coming to life at the same time. The discipline of political economy, which would eventually become the formal study of economics, was emerging. Thinkers were preoccupied with how markets and commerce shone, as new routes of trade emerged all around them. Some, like the alchemists who had obsessively aimed to turn lead into gold, were mostly concerned with how they could make their own fortune. At the turn of the 17th century, money was still overwhelmingly backed by gold and silver, assets which were both valuable and portable. But the limited supply of precious metals, the factor that made them valuable in the first place, was also becoming a barrier to trade. In places where carrying a lot of valuable currency was difficult or dangerous, especially in the budding settlements in the New World, alternative methods of exchange were emerging. Money was sometimes backed by paper IOU, which could be converted into precious metals by their issuers. The delicate system of trust was the beginning of what would eventually become far more widely accepted banknotes. Some financial innovators began to think more boldly. If gold could be the backstop of paper money, why couldn't any other form of wealth, perhaps land, a far more valuable asset than gold, could be deployed as the security against huge volumes of credit, boosting the supply of paper money? Ideas about the relationship between land and money bubbled through networks of discussion and debate across Europe. Could land, the most adventurous thinkers, wondered, even become the backing of an entire currency? Borrowing money against the value of land was hardly a new invention. The word mortgage entered the English language with the Norman conquerors who arrived in the 11th century. The gage was a pledge, a promise to the borrower to repay. Further back, the Roman Empire had markets in land and mortgage lending to go alongside them. But lending money against land was controversial and difficult in large parts of the pre-industrial world. Restrictions on usury in Christian and Muslim countries were often huge barriers to lenders and borrowers alike. The legal and record-keeping institutions that explained who owned what and who owed what were often lacking. Deploying land as the backing for loans violated some of the principles of an agricultural aristocracy too. Land holdings conveyed enormous power over the tenants of the land and across the country at large. Those responsibilities and rights could not simply be exchanged at the whims of the current owner. Using land as collateral required that the lender be able to claim the asset if he wasn't repaid. In some nations, a powerful landlord's sons, grandsons, and descendants not yet born had a moral right to their inheritance, and cash-strapped members of the gentry could not simply risk the family's all-important assets on some unscrupulous moneylender. But the old rules of aristocratic society were falling to the wayside, along with a range of prohibitions and limitations on financial activity. The necessary record-keeping and rules that would allow for a far more extensive financial system were emerging, and the role of land in finance was being unleashed. For the first time in history, the asset was beginning to rise to its current position as a banker's best friend. The unique attributes of land, that it is impossible to hide and doesn't decay, make it the perfect collateral to guarantee a loan. A crafty borrower cannot run away with it, and it is unlikely, or so it seems, to suddenly collapse in value before the loan is repaid. For borrowers, using land to borrow money was ideal too. They did not have to pawn their assets to a creditor, as they would with any precious metals or other trinkets. They could keep using the land which they had borrowed against for farming, housing, or the operation of a business, while also accessing a loan of greater size and at lower interest rates than would otherwise ever be available to them. The insight that land could be transformed into liquid financial power, and at enormous scale, is still one which is molding the world today. The asset is still ultimately the biggest single source of security against credit globally. Loans extended against the value of real estate in the form of residential and commercial mortgages are the most common forms of borrowing. The very smallest enterprises usually borrow by offering their modest holdings of land, often in the form of an entrepreneur's home, as collateral against the loan. In the poorest and worst governed economies, companies and individuals with the ability to prove that they own a particular plot have precious financial heft that those without it lack. Today, around the world, bank lending is overwhelmingly made up of mortgage loans. In America and Britain, 61% and 68% of bank loans are mortgages, up from 32% and 9% respectively at the beginning of the 20th century. But even those numbers downplay the huge role of land. It is not just loans to buy property that matter, but the huge share of business lending globally that is backed with land. Some countries have discovered the ability to use land sales and leases as a replacement for taxation, giving the government enormous fiscal firepower, a feature that gives rise to its own dire problems. The world's oldest form of wealth is the beating heart of the modern system of credit in the global economy, and it is just as important, perhaps even more important, to this vital role than it ever has been. In the early days of industrialization in Europe and America, the role of land in finance was beginning to grow, but so too were the tremendous financial risks surrounding it. The assets. Deployment as a safeguard for lenders has made it an unfortunate crucial player in most of the wounding financial crises over the last 3 centuries. Because banks are so intimately exposed to land markets, almost every crash, slump, and downturn of any importance relates to some land-related turmoil. As asset prices go up, banks can comfortably extend more and more credit to borrowers based on the new and higher value of their land holdings. When prices fall, creditors are suddenly deprived of their valuable security against default and become far more reluctant to lend. The decline in investment that follows can turn an economic boom into a bust. Investors, financiers, and central bankers have gone through endless cycles of arrogance, implosion, and regret, realizing only after the fact that they were riding a wave of surging land prices, rather than profiting from some new form of financial genius. The fact that land does not decay makes its price enormously sensitive to expectations of the distant future. When outlooks for the future are optimistic, when growth is buoyant, or when the population of an area is expected to keep rising, land can be a popular object for speculation. Much of the time, the speculation about the future proves to be correct. But it can also tip into outright financial mania. In places where land has risen rapidly in price, an ever-growing group of investors pile in for further rapid gains. First movers. In any frenzy will mop up the lion's share of any gains, and latecomers, often with less financial expertise than those early birds, will be left holding the bag in the event of a downturn. The cycle of booms, financial busts, and lingering recessions is an American tradition running from the speculation on rural land in colonial Virginia through a series of land booms in the 19th century, often based around the development of railroads and leading all the way to the mortgage-backed cataclysm of 2008. But it is certainly not a phenomenon unique to the United States. Slumps in land markets plunged Ireland and southern Europe into brutal financial crises after 2008 too. The financial convulsion of Japan's economy in the early 1990s, the beginning of the lost decades from which the country has never truly recovered, are intimately tied to the country's post-war land boom. Today, China is beginning to confront the immense financial consequences of perhaps the biggest land bubble in human history. The unique attributes of land as an asset, its scarcity, immovability, and essentially indefinite shelf life, are also what make it a tremendous source of conflict. Disputes over land, who should own it, and how it should be used, have been the fuel of wars between nations, the inspiration of guerrilla movements for national liberation, and the obsessive object of political radicals. The word. Land appears in the title of more than a dozen national anthems, and the lyrics of dozens more. It is not just blood that nationalists agitate over, but soil too. Land is an object of envy on the part of people who own none of it, and a keen focus of anxiety for its fortunate owners, who are desperate to protect their greatest source of wealth. But even where it is not the cause of armed violence, as it has been over and over again throughout the course of history, land is the hidden core of political disputes the world over. For several decades, during the twilight of the 19th century, and the years leading up to the First World War, it looked as if the issue of land, and the way in which enormous landlords benefited from the booming industrial economy, would be the defining political battle of the 20th century. The most well-read political thinker of the 19th century was not Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, or Georg Hegel, whose legacies have stretched on long since their deaths, but Henry George, a San Francisco journalist who mounted a tireless political crusade over the injustices of land. In New York and London, across Europe, and as far away as Australia, New Zealand, Cuba, Spain, and China, radical political movements homed in on land ownership as the single crucial issue that explained the increasingly visible injustices associated with the newly urban world, and why so much grinding poverty seemed to run alongside enormous new wealth. To an observer at the end of the 19th century, it might have looked as if land would be one of the defining battle lines of 20th century politics. Reality proved to be very different. Land became all but irrelevant, driven to the margins of debate by huge shifts in politics around the world and the emergence of a large and prosperous middle class. In Britain, America, and much of the rest of the rich world, widespread home ownership transformed a landed elite into a landed majority. The political left, which had once joined the uproar over the iniquity of land ownership, began to lose interest in the asset. To the socialists and communists who were growing in influence, land was simply one form of capital, among many others that had to be undermined, or even seized and appropriated. But even as land disappeared from the discussion in politics, its role was ever more vital in business, quietly becoming the linchpin of the global financial system. The political conflict caused by land was hidden away, but it was never eliminated. It is likely to pop up again and again. If there are huge winners from land wealth, there will be losers too. When prices rise, as they have been doing, often rapidly, in large and important parts of the world over much of the past half-century, the unmeritocratic nature of land ownership becomes increasingly obvious. The winners who were lucky enough to buy land at the right time and in the right spot have been able to reap huge rewards. Dramatic shifts in the economic geography of the developed world over the last 4 decades, and the growing dominance of highly productive and desirable cities have only magnified the importance of land as an asset. Buyers who didn't get into the hottest markets at the earliest opportunity, or who had the misfortune to buy in a declining region, have lost not only the opportunities that come with a thriving area, but also their greatest source of personal wealth and a crucial guarantee of their children's prosperity. The reality of how land works leaves governments all around the world torn between irreconcilable goals. They are anxious to promote home ownership, which remains the aspiration of billions of families, just as it has been since the demise of feudalism. At the same time, political leaders are desperate not to lose the support of the existing crop of owners, who are keen for the value of their real estate to rise. Unlike a century ago, homeowners now make up a majority of most developed countries and an even larger share of the voting population. It is impossible to achieve both mass home ownership and constant rapid increases in the value of land. The defense of land wealth is what props up huge and pernicious advantages in the tax and financial systems, which have helped to make land a highly profitable asset to own throughout modern history. Combined with its zero-sum nature, those advantages also magnify the inequality in wealth driven by land ownership. The unique attributes of the world's oldest asset, and the credit, crises, and conflict that it generates, are a thread that runs through the last 3 centuries of history and into the modern day. Because of land's crucial position, the prospect of either a sustained rise or a sharp fall in land prices each pose immense threats, whether from the erosion of economic dynamism or a poisonous climb in unmerited wealth inequality. Surges in land prices are the cause of credit booms and busts among both homebuyers and businesses. They are a magnifier of the growing inequality between lucky landowners and non-owners, between places that are successful and those that are on the decline, and the bitter political battles that come with it. The distribution of land determines which businesses can borrow, shifting investment towards the already land-rich. When prices fall, our perilously landlocked financial systems are put at serious financial risk, leading to collapses that have sometimes proved unrecoverable. Making sense of land doesn't just fill a missing part of the puzzle of how the world works. It reveals the immense trap that countries around the world find themselves